Okay, so it's really good to be together once again. And this week we're looking at chapters 51 to 57. 51 to 57. And I've entitled this The Example of a Lord and a Servant. But actually, the chapters I've given you are a sort of two parts. The first part is chapter 50 and 51, which is very much about unfolding the example that she got. And then the second part is all about how she tried to how she took what she had seen in the example and then understood it in her own life and how we intimately relate to God. So what I want to do is for this introduction is I really want to focus on just chapter 51 because it really does stand out amongst the whole of her text. It's very much the longest chapter that she writes, and so it comes together as this great body of overflowing of Julian's writing and interpretation, and it's quite dense and it's complex and it's also extraordinarily beautiful in the theology that she expresses. One of the interesting things about chapter 51 is that it doesn't appear in the short text at all. There's no reference to it whatsoever. And she tells us, if you remember, within that chapter, that it took her 20 years, save 3 months, to actually think about what she'd received and begin to understand so that she could write it down. So it sounds like she had this example, as she calls it, back, way back in 1373, but it took her that long to really think about it, interpret it, and then write it down. Now, that's really key for textual scholars like myself, because what it says is that the long text cannot be written before 1373. It's got to be post that date because she's given us, 23 minus 3 months. So even my maths can do that 20 years on from 1373 is 1393. So she's got to have written her long text after that date. Now, the example is therefore given at the same time as when she had the rest of her showings. What is a really interesting question, and I don't have an answer for it, and I wonder what you will think about this, is why doesn't she name it as one of her showings? Why is it called something entirely different, an example or parable as that's translated, and it's not her 17th showing or one of those 16 showings? I don't know why. And so maybe it's something for you to muse about, that there's something about this that is different from the other showings that she received. Right at the beginning in chapter 50, which you would have read at the beginning, we find out that actually chapter 51 is given in response to a question that Julian has asked. And it's a question that's actually been lingering in the background for a while. If you remember when we thought about that wonderful statement, all shall be well, there was a lot of anxiety around Julian about, how can everything be well when people are in hell? How can everything be well when there's sin in the world? So it's out of that kind of anxiety, that kind of questioning that she's had of Jesus, that once again, she comes to this questioning mode. The core of the problem, once again for Julian, it's something that lingers on, is that her showing is saying something very different to what the church teaches. So it's like, how The church teaches that we need to look on sin very grievously all the time. That's what she says. And that we're to blame for sin. But she says that she sees no blame in God. And in fact, her revelation goes on to say that God looks at us as if we were as pure and as holy as angels are in heaven. So this is so not marrying up with her understanding of sin at the time. So if you remember, we talked quite a lot about sin and how to define it in its different species and its different properties, you know, so you know exactly what you've done wrong and you can name it. Either it's vanity or it's pride or it's whatever. So knowing about it. And she says that in her revelation that actually she didn't see sin. She saw sin was no thing. All she understands about sin is the effect that it has, the great wounding that it does of a person, and the great trouble and the trauma that it is in a person's life. So her teaching is therefore her revelation, therefore, in how God views sin, is absolutely going against the teaching of Holy Church. Now, Julian is really worried about this. And she's so worried that she says she feels that she is blinded by her concern for this. And she's concerned, therefore, that because she's so blinded and taken over by this concern, this worry, that actually she will no longer receive her revelation. She'll no longer be open to hearing the words of God, knowing, you know, receiving the divine revelation that he wants to give her. So either she needs to know, as we hear in chapter 50, she either needs to see how God sees sin, that it's absolutely done away with, that God does not see sin, or she needs to see how God sees sin, so that she can know how she herself is to understand what sin is, and therefore what sort of blame is ours. Now, why is she so concerned? Why is she so concerned? Well, there are kind of four reasons for this. The first is that, you know, this is going against the teaching of Holy Church that you need to go to confession, that sin is not nothing. It's very much what we do, and we have to take responsibility for it, and we have to go to confession and name it. And only if we name it, we have contrition, and we try and make satisfaction, will actually sin therefore be forgiven. So that whole process of the sacrament of penance is very important in the medieval world. And you have to do the whole of it to then receive the forgiveness and the reconciliation from God through the person of the priest. So you can hear already that what she's saying about sin, well, how God sees it, is directly confronting even what Holy Church is saying. So that's why she's so worried, because, you know, it's in direct opposition. Secondly, if that's the case, that God sees it so differently, and the teaching of Holy Church is therefore not so much wrong, but it's to be re-understood or envisioned differently, then she's got to get this right, because her mortal soul is at stake. And she was on her deathbed at the time. And if she doesn't confess her sins, then she's right in that period of her life where she could be damned to hell in her understanding of the world. So this is very serious for Julian's mortal soul. The third thing is that if this is wrong, okay, if the teaching of Holy Church is right and what she's seen in her revelation is wrong, then it actually undermines everything she's seen in her revelations. So she begins to get into that state where we saw the wonderful Marjorie Kemp, you know, going to Julian because she wants reassurance from Julian that her visions are actually correct. And Julian gives her that wonderful discernment to show her how she's understand that. So here we have Julian herself in a similar kind of tortured, is my revelation false? And finally, perhaps one of the most important is that if she goes against the teaching of Holy Church, she could be dancing around as a heretic. She could easily be pulled up before the authorities. And of course, at this time, there was a lot of unrest within the church. Lots of things were being questioned within the church. First of all, the efficacy of the priest at confession. Secondly, the actual teaching of church itself on the sacraments. Actually, you don't need the sacraments. You can pray directly to God. And thirdly, about the teaching of women. So all of these things were being highly questioned. And so it was a very sensitive period. And we often lump all this under the title of Lollard. But actually, it was a much more complex atmosphere and landscape at the time. And of course, there were some people who you could define as Lollards, but there was this general dis-ease. So Julian has to be careful about what she says, but also I think there's more than that. I don't think she's just saying this because she's worried about being heretic. I think Julian has a bit more gumption in her than that. I think she's worried because actually she's a daughter of the church. She loves the church, and we get that sense throughout. You know, your Holy Mother Church is how she understands the role of Jesus. You know, Jesus, our mother, you see in the church as Holy Mother Church. And so there's something important for Julian that actually this could undermine her understanding of her beloved church. So she's really at loggerheads. So she asks. And even then she has to summon up the courage to ask. And it's interesting, she gives us a justification for asking. And this again is all in chapter 50. It's a kind of, you know, builds up to chapter 51. And the justification she's given is really interesting. First of all, she says it's so lowly a thing to ask. Now, when we understand that word lowly, that's the Middle English word that she's using, lowly. It's not that she's saying, oh, this is insignificant. This is, you know, it's little, it's not of importance. That's not what she's saying at all. What you need to have in your mind is go back to chapter 5 and the first revelation, where she sees the whole of created thing as a tiny little ball, a little thing. And that's what she's referring back to, in a sense, is that what she's asking is about the smallness of creation. It's that creation isn't really that great a thing. It's very small. It's at the lowest rung of understanding. So that's what she means when she says it's a little or a lowly thing, is that it's because she's asking about something that is of the world, you know. And therefore she says, you know, well, maybe, even though I was scared to ask, maybe that's okay. I can ask about something because it's not about the secrets of the way God works. And then she also says that it's something about the natural order. It's common. So you're using the word here, not as it's an everyday thing and everyone knows about it. You know, everyone asks about the Holy Church. It's not about that, but common again, if you go back right to when she first received her revelations, do you remember? The priest came and held the crucifix before Jesus, and she said it took on a common light. Well, there, common, and also here is it's talking about natural. It's of the natural order. So she's talking about the natural order of how things are. And that's why she feels justified to be able to ask, because once again, it's not presumptuous. She's not trying to get something special. She just wants to understand, how can she live in this world, this ordinary world, and understand how God sees sin. And if it's different to how she sees sin, she really wants to know. And finally, she wants to know because she really wants to know. This is really eating her up. And so that sense of anxiety. So God puts her out of her misery and gives her what's called a marvelous example. Now, that's the Middle English word that we find in the Sloane manuscript. The Sloane manuscript, which is in the British Library, it's slightly later one, but it's the text which has most of the Middle English words retained in it. And our chap, Barry Windiett, he translates it as a parable. Now, both of those words are quite interesting. The one that's in the medieval text and also the one that Barry uses. The first example is because it echoes the idea of an exemplum. Now, this might be why Julian doesn't call it a vision or a showing. This might be why she doesn't include it in her 16 showings, because she sees it as an exemplum. Now, in the time of the late medieval period, one of the big things that people liked about sermons wasn't so much the moral message, but it was the exemplums that were actually used to illuminate the moral message or the sermon. And these could be quite anecdotal, they could be quite brief or extended, they could be real or fictitious, they could be fables or folk tales or legends. So you can hear already, you go to hear the preacher because they got these great little stories and snippets, not so much about the moral stuff, but they get these great little stories. So they're great storytellers. And they're trying to elucidate a point of doctrine, but for the medieval listener, they are actually quite entertaining. And if you remember, it was the Franciscans who were absolute masters of telling the story of Jesus in really real and exciting and wonderful ways. And actually, these exemplum or exemplar were often gathered into books. So there's quite a famous one by Jacques de Vitry in the 1200s, gathered it all together. And then a preacher could use it and go, oh, what do I want to preach on today? Oh, let's use that story. Very handy. Wish we had them today. Now, if you want an example of an exemplar, or an example, then there's no better place than going to Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales and the wonderful Pardoner's Tale. Now, if you remember that Pardoner's Tale, he has this whole little sermon at the beginning about greed is the root of all evil. And then he tells this wonderful story about 3 debauched men who go out and they meet this old man. And this old man says, I'm looking for death because I want to die and I can't find him. And they say, well, where is he? And he said, well, I think he might be round there, down by that tree. And they rush off because they're going to fight death. And they find a big bag of gold. And of course, they end up by just killing each other. And that is that is the little story that exemplifies that, greed is the root of all evil. But that's a wonderful example of what an exemplar is. So if you have that in your head when you're reading chapter 51, then it starts to be quite interesting and begin to understand a little bit about why Julian might have used it instead of using the language of visions. The other thing is Barry Windiat uses the language of parable. He translates that word parable. And again, this is a really interesting understanding of this chapter, because as we know, parables are what Jesus said. He gave us parables. And do you remember he said, to ordinary people, I tell them, because they will not understand, they cannot understand, but for you, you will understand. And they're all about stories which have multiple levels of meaning. And when you go back to parables, you have one understanding. And then when you go back to it another time, there's another understanding. And parables are something you live with, and you live out your faith through understanding the stories of the parable. So the power of story to express truth is really important and a major part of Jesus's ministry. Now, if we think about it, we have therefore a parable or an exemplar, or exemplum, which is about a lord and a servant. Now, lords and servants turn up in Scripture. Probably the most important one, where you just have a lord and a servant, is in Luke 17, 7-10, when Jesus describes a servant who works in the field and then comes back after a hard day's work and then goes and serves at table. And that is right. It will not be the servant, the master who then serves the servant, come back. And then at the end of the day, all the servant will say, we are unworthy servants. We have only done our duty. So that sense in which the servant is the person who comes, the servant is the person who serves and works and does their duty. And then, of course, a little bit later in Luke 22, Jesus then describes himself as the one who is the servant. I come to you as one who serves. So we have these two notions of our role is merely to serve, to follow our duty, but also Christ is the one who serves and identifies, therefore, with us and with our role of service as a servant. Now, already you can begin to see, aha, that is having echoes within Julian's chapter 51, where we have this notion of Adam, who is the servant, and Christ, who is the servant, and understanding the servant on multiple levels. The other thing about this example is that it has amazing echoes of St. Anselm's theology of atonement, which you find in Cadeus Homo. And the argument there is that God decreed that since the fall, man should not have the power to avoid sin or punishment of sin. And there's the objection that comes in and says, well, since man is unable to avoid sinning, God ought not to judge him or blame him because he doesn't have the power anymore to do it. He has no capacity not to sin. So don't blame poor old humanity for sinning. And then Anselm makes this really good reply. He likens humanity to a slave whom the master assigned to a work and warned beforehand against falling into a deep ditch from which he would be unable to extricate himself. So once again, there we are. We hear Julian, but it is different. It is very different. The slave in Anselm despises his master's command, and he promptly jumps into the ditch, and so is unable to complete the task. Similarly, Anselm argues, man's impotence serves rather to increase his crime and to double his sin. For, he says, his very inability is guilt, for he ought not to have done it. So you can hear once again that sin for Anselm is not only that he disobeyed, but also that he did not have the capacity. First of all, he did not have the capacity, and then secondly, he used his will to go and jump in the ditch and actually disobey the Lord. For Anselm, therefore, sin is not giving to God his due. It's actually saying, yeah, I know what you say, God, but I'm going to do the exact opposite. So it's sort of, sin is therefore heinous because it absolutely goes against the supreme justice and the holiness of God. So Anselm teaches that the spirituality of true obedience, for without uprightness of will, no work is acceptable to God. So again, we have these real parallels with Julian, but very different in Julian, because we have the servant running off for love to fulfill the Lord's wish, not to sort of go, yeah, whatever, I'm going to do exactly what you don't want me to do. It's that absolute difference of, despising the Lord to loving the Lord. Completely different understanding, but it's the same image. And you cannot but think Julian must have known this very, very famous understanding of atonement and how Christ came and atoned for our sins, because, as Anselm says, therefore, the only way we can atone for our sins is if we have someone who is sinless, who loves God, who's never done anything wrong, and always upholds God's justice and holiness. And that has to be God himself. It has to be a God-man. So why did God become man? Codeus homo. And if you notice within the whole of the example, we have this notion of the double vision. She sets off at the beginning, this is Adam. I understood it as Adam. And in a sense, you can kind of follow that. Oh, yeah, the servant is Adam. And then slightly, she begins to shift it around until you begin to see that it's not only Adam, but also Christ. And what I find amazing about this with Julian is that she doesn't say that first of all, there was Adam and then there was Christ, but she kind of melds them two together and says, when Adam fell, Christ fell into the maiden's womb. So the fall becomes the incarnation. So time kind of gets compressed into one. It's not linear at all. It's not like, Adam messed up and Christ came to kind of put it all right, which is the sense you get in Anselm. But in Julian, it's absolutely squashed together, so that the pains that the servant experiences in the ditch are actually the very words she uses to describe the suffering of Christ on the cross. And then it ends in this incredible understanding of, therefore, what is human nature. She goes on and talks about that we have a godly will. No, it's not us who have a godly will. It's not like inside of us, every human being, there's a nice little person who's us. It's not what she's talking about at all. She's saying because Christ has taken on the humanity. It means that within us is the throne, is the city, is the place where Christ dwells, sits, is the best place, the place that the Lord longs to be. And we hear all that imagery from John of mutual indwelling, and we hear all that, imagery from Paul about we are the temples of the Spirit. It's all there, being reimagined and expressed anew by Julian in her understanding of atonement. So her whole text sort of shimmers with scriptural references. I have to say that I went to a series of lectures when I was in Oxford, and the late Marilyn McCord Adams, the most amazing lady, who came over from the States, and she was Regis Professor over in Oxford, and I went to her lecture series. She and I talked a lot about Julian, and she concluded her whole lecture series. So she basically went from, Oregon all the way through, all the way through, Augustine, Anselm, everyone, Duns Scotus, all of them. And she came at last, and her last lecture was on Julian. And she said, of all the medieval theology about atonement, it was Julian who cracked it. And I think she's so right, because her understanding of the atonement just makes sense of the loving God, and not the Old Testament God of wrath and blame. It's the God that we understand in Jesus. So I really hope you enjoy chapter 51. It's an incredible chapter, and it's one of those chapters I go back to and I go back to, and absolutely that is the theology that seems to ring true to me, rather than penal substitution and all that. It's what I understand as what God has done for us.